Scarlet stepped off the bus, placing her large bag on the pavement. She took a deep breath of fresh air, savoring the distinct scent only found in the countryside. It was a blend of cut grass, morning dew, and meadow flowers, a smell familiar to anyone who had spent time in such surroundings. Closing her eyes for a brief moment, she whispered to herself with a serene smile, "I'm home. Finally, I'm home." An elderly woman nearby squinted at her in the sunlight. "Hello, Scarlet. Is that really you?" she asked. Scarlet beamed, recognizing her neighbor. "Yes, Emma, it's me," she replied with enthusiasm. As they spoke, several women standing outside a nearby store noticed Scarlet. They fell silent, their curious gazes fixed on her. "Are you back for good or just visiting?" asked Laura, a woman known for knowing everything about everyone in the village. "I'll be staying for a while, and then we'll see," Scarlet responded. Laura smirked. Well.
Where's the child?" "She left pregnant, didn't she?" she whispered to the group. "We don't know. Maybe she gave it to an orphanage or sold it. Happens all the time these days," Emma added nonchalantly. Scarlet, now walking toward her house, could feel the women's eyes on her, lingering judgmentally. Who would have thought she'd be so shameless? "It's a good thing her parents aren't alive to witness this disgrace," Emma muttered with indignation. "I bet we'll have to watch our husbands now," Laura quipped, eyeing Scarlet suspiciously. Scarlet had left her hometown a year ago. During that time, her life had been marked by tragedy. First, her father passed away, followed closely by her mother. The grief was overwhelming, but Dan, her childhood friend, had been there for her. Living nearby, he couldn't bear to see her suffer. His constant support helped distract her from her sorrow, and over time, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. However, Dan was already married, and Scarlet knew she couldn't allow herself to ruin his family. Despite her intentions, Scarlet became pregnant, and soon the entire village knew about her relationship with Dan. Isolated from the rest of the villagers, it became obvious to everyone that Dan was the father of her unborn child. A scandal erupted, and Dan's mother, Betty, confronted Scarlet, pleading with her to leave and not destroy her son's marriage. Under immense pressure and stress, Scarlet left, but unfortunately she lost the pregnancy. For almost a year, she lived in the city, working as a cleaner in a store, but the city never felt like home. She longed for the familiarity of her village, and eventually, she decided to return. Struggling with the rusty lock, Scarlet finally opened the door to her house. As she entered and sat beside a portrait of her parents, she broke down in tears. Suddenly, a loud voice startled her. "What are you doing here?" Britney, Dan's wife, had stormed into the room, her face contorted with anger. Scarlet remained calm. "Hello, Britney. Why are you yelling? You're not at home," she said firmly. Over the past year, Scarlet had changed. Life had taught her to be strong and resilient, and she no longer allowed herself to be easily intimidated. Britney's outburst didn't faze her. "Why did you come back? Aren't you ashamed after everything you've done?" Britney's voice was filled with rage. Scarlet smirked. "Ashamed? No, I've already paid for my mistakes. We're all human, Britney. I don't have any feelings left for Dan. You can live in peace. But I'm not leaving my home, and if you don't like it, you can go." Britney was taken aback. She had always thought of Scarlet as a weak, quiet girl. But seeing the confidence and strength Scarlet now carried, she realized she had a formidable rival. Without another word, Britney turned and left the house, knowing her once carefree life was over. She rushed to her mother-in-law, Betty, in distress. Scarlet's back, she sobbed. "What? I told her never to show her face here again." "How dare she?" Betty exclaimed. "She's changed," Britney replied, her voice distant. "She's confident now. Something's different about her." "Did she come with the child?" Betty asked. "No one knows where her child is," Britney said, still in shock. "What does Dan think?" Betty pressed. "He doesn't know yet. He's at work," Britney responded. "Go home. I'll talk to Dan tonight. He needs to stay away from that girl," Betty said sternly. Britney was distraught, realizing she might lose Dan. The only thing keeping him tied to her was their daughter, Katie. Dan adored Katie, and Britney knew he wouldn't abandon his child for Scarlet. Still shaken, Britney returned home, poured herself a glass of wine, and drank it in one swift gulp. The alcohol helped to calm her nerves. She knew she had a fight ahead of her, one she wasn't sure she could win. "I won't let you take my husband." "I won't give him up," Britney whispered confidently, pouring herself another glass of wine. Betty entered the house and was met with an unpleasant sight. Britney was fast asleep, while her 5-year-old daughter, Katie, sat on the bed near her mother's legs. "Katie, have you been crying?" Betty asked, noticing the tear-stained face of the child. "Britney, wake up," she urged, trying to rouse her daughter-in-law, but Britney only mumbled something incoherent and rolled over, falling back asleep. At that moment, Dan came home from work. "Dan, look at this. She's drunk, and the child is sitting here hungry and crying. This is all your fault." Betty exclaimed angrily. "How is it my fault?" Dan replied, confused. "Scarlet is back." "That's why Britney got drunk," Betty revealed. "Scarlet's back?" Dan froze in place. "Don't you dare go near Scarlet. Swear it on your daughter," Betty demanded. "Mom, please stay out of my life." "You interfered once, and look what came of it," Dan said, gesturing toward his sleeping wife. "I'll handle it myself." "As you wish, but if you leave your wife, you are no longer my son," Betty warned before storming out, slamming the door behind her. Dan sighed heavily as he picked up Katie. He couldn't understand why his mother was so protective of Britney. She had been the one who insisted he marry a woman he never loved. He remembered the day Britney and her parents came to his house to announce that he would soon be a father. Young and inexperienced, Dan had given in to the pressure. Over time, he realized he had made a mistake by marrying Britney due to his mother's influence and Britney's tears. Sometimes, Dan looked at his daughter and couldn't see any resemblance between them. He stayed with Britney out of obligation, confusing his initial attraction for love. It wasn't until he fell in love with Scarlet that he understood what real love felt like. He had been determined to stay with Scarlet, but she had disappeared from his life without explanation, leaving him to realize just how hard it was to live without her. "Are you hungry?" he asked Katie, pushing aside his thoughts. "Yes," the little girl replied softly. "Let's go make something," Dan said with a wink. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Daddy won't let anyone hurt you." After dinner, Dan and Katie settled in to watch cartoons. After some time, cries were heard from the bedroom. Britney had woken up. Katie immediately hugged her father. "Go on, sweetie. Play outside for a bit. Mommy and I need to talk," Dan said, kissing his daughter's forehead. Katie left, and Dan turned to his wife. "You came," Britney muttered. "Why don't you just go to her?" "Get out of here." "Britney, have you looked at yourself in the mirror? Aren't you ashamed?" Dan said calmly, but Britney began crying, blaming him for all her problems. Katie, hiding behind the house, could hear her mother's angry voice. The little girl was frightened, as her mother became unpredictable when she was like this. Quietly, Katie cried. Meanwhile, Scarlet finished cleaning her house and stepped into her garden, enjoying the peaceful evening. Hearing soft sobs, she tensed. She followed the sound and found a little girl hiding under a bush. "Hey, why are you crying?" Scarlet smiled kindly. "Who are you?" Katie asked, wiping her tears away. "I'm your neighbor. Do you live over there?" Scarlet pointed to Dan's house. "Yes. Do you live in that empty house?" Katie asked. "It's not empty anymore," Scarlet smiled. "Did someone hurt you?" "Why are you hiding here?" "That's my mom yelling." "I don't want to go back home," Katie said. "Where's your dad?" "At home. We were watching cartoons until Mom woke up. She's acting strange today," Katie explained. "What do you mean by strange?" Scarlet asked. "Sometimes she becomes a stranger. I start to fear her," Katie admitted. "Don't be afraid," Scarlet said softly. "Would you like some tea? I have chocolate candies too." Katie's eyes lit up. "I do." "Come on then," Scarlet smiled. "It's better than sitting in the bushes." Scarlet and Katie were almost finished with their tea when they heard Dan's voice calling. "Katie, sweetheart." "Daddy, I'm here," Katie shouted. A moment later, Dan appeared in the garden. He was taken aback when he saw Katie peacefully drinking tea with Scarlet. "Dad, meet our neighbor. Her name is Scarlet, and she's very kind. She gave me tea and candies," Katie said proudly. "Katie, who said you could leave the yard without asking?" Dan scolded gently. "Don't scold her." "I invited her," Scarlet interjected. "Come on, Katie. It's time for bed," Dan said, taking his daughter's hand. Katie quickly jumped off her chair and ran to him. Dan hesitated for a moment before looking at Scarlet. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "No, we have nothing to talk about." "Leave," Scarlet replied firmly before rushing back inside and closing the door behind her. She leaned against the cold wall and began to cry. "I won't let you back into my life. I don't need anyone," she whispered to herself. Dan tucked Katie into bed and returned outside, his thoughts a mess. He had convinced himself that his feelings for Scarlet were in the past, but seeing her again today reminded him how much he still loved her. "You can't sleep?" Britney smirked, staggering out of the house. She opened a bottle of wine and took a large gulp. "Give that here," Dan yelled angrily, snatching the bottle from her and pouring its contents on the ground. "So what? I'll just buy more tomorrow." Britney laughed. "Britney, what more do you need? Am I a bad husband? A bad father? What's going on?" Dan asked, trying to understand his wife's behavior. "I'm missing everything," Britney shouted. "If you go back to Scarlet, I'll take Katie and leave for my parents' house." "You won't take her. Haven't you noticed how you've become an alcoholic? I won't let you take Katie. And I'm starting to run out of patience. Are you not afraid I'll kick you out myself?" Dan snapped. "Kick me out?" Britney screamed. "You have no rights over Katie. She's not even your child. You don't have any children, not even with Scarlet. She sold your child." Dan grabbed Britney by the collar, barely controlling himself. "Go to bed now, we'll talk tomorrow." Realizing she had crossed the line, Britney silently retreated into the house. Dan, though angered, didn't pay much attention to her drunken words, but the mention of his child stirred something in him. He knew he had to speak to Scarlet to find out the truth. Scarlet had left the village a year ago, pregnant, so Dan found it only natural to ask her the question that had been gnawing at him. Quietly, he sneaked into her yard and approached her house. The light was on in one of the windows, but he hesitated for a long time, unsure if he had the right to bring up the past. Summoning his courage, he gently tapped on the window. "I said leave me alone," Scarlet shouted as she rushed outside. Seeing Dan, she stopped abruptly. "What are you doing here? What right do you have to come to me in the middle of the night?" "I'm sorry," Dan stammered. "We need to talk. It's inevitable, after all. We live next door now. There's no point in avoiding this." "About what?" Scarlet smirked. "You have your life, and I have mine. The neighbors say you left our child at an orphanage. Is that true?" Dan asked directly. Scarlet gave a sad smile. "No, Dan, he wasn't born." Her voice softened. "Please, don't come here again." "I'm sorry," Dan muttered, his words barely coherent as Scarlet turned and walked back into her house. She knew she should have told him everything. Dan had the right to know that he had been the father of her unborn child. But what could the village gossips say now? She had stopped caring about their opinions. It was her life, and no one had the right to tell her how to live it. That night, Dan couldn't sleep. He sat silently in his armchair, staring at the ceiling, lost in his thoughts. Early the next morning, Britney woke up and was surprised to see her husband still sitting there. "Dan, you didn't sleep?" she asked softly. "No," Dan replied calmly. "Dan, forgive me. I drank too much last night. I don't know what came over me," Britney said, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "Britney, I'm warning you for the last time. If I see you with a glass of wine in your hand again, I won't be responsible for what I do." Dan said, his voice stern. "No, you won't see it again. I promise," she whispered. "Britney, yesterday you said something. That Katie isn't my daughter. What did you mean by that?" Dan asked directly. Britney froze, stammering, "Me? How could I say such a thing?" But Dan saw the fear and embarrassment in her eyes and realized that she had spoken the truth. People had told him before that parents with dark hair and brown eyes couldn't have a child with blonde hair and blue eyes. But he had never paid much attention to those comments. Dan loved Katie with all his heart and had never questioned if she was his biological daughter until now. Dan was filled with anger. He realized that Britney had not only ruined his life by preventing him from being with the woman he loved, but she had also lied about Katie being his child. Meanwhile, Britney busied herself preparing lunch, tidying the house, and going to the store. She felt guilty about what had happened the night before and decided to bake Dan's favorite pie. When she left the store, she saw Scarlet and greeted her politely, despite their shared history. "Good afternoon," Scarlet said, smiling. Britney muttered a response, lowering her head. From across the street, Laura, the village gossip, observed the exchange. "What is this? Scarlet has no shame at all. Instead of hiding away, she walks around the village like nothing happened. Now she's even talking to Britney." Laura exclaimed to no one in particular. "Why are you tolerating this humiliation? You should grab her by the hair." "Mind your own business, Laura." Britney snapped. "Do you even do any housework? Or do you just spend all day gossiping at the store? Look at her, Laura shouted, not backing down. A drunkard. No wonder Dan cheats on you. Britney ran home in tears. She had never felt so humiliated in her life. She pulled a bottle of alcohol from the cupboard and headed to the kitchen. "Mom, you promised you wouldn't drink anymore," Katie said, sleepily entering the room. "Dad will be home soon, and you'll start arguing again." "Go play in the yard," Britney snapped. Katie lowered her head and quietly left the kitchen. Britney finished the bottle, chuckling nervously. She wanted to prove to the village that she was strong and wouldn't tolerate anyone humiliating her. Turning up the music, Britney grabbed a shovel and staggered towards Scarlet's house. "Britney, stop," Dan shouted, seeing what his wife was about to do. "Where are you going?" "I'm going to break your beloved's windows," Britney screamed, swinging the shovel. "Give me the shovel," Dan demanded. "Back off." Britney yelled, waving the shovel threateningly before staggering back toward her own veranda. In her drunken rage, she didn't realize she had started smashing the windows of their own house. Katie, terrified by her mother's outburst, screamed and ran out of the house. Dan wrestled the shovel away from Britney and dragged her into the basement. "Calm down and sleep it off." "We'll talk later," he shouted angrily. Katie ran as fast as she could, her small heart pounding with fear. Scarlet, hearing the commotion, quickly caught up to her. "Katie, what happened? Who scared you?" Scarlet asked, kneeling down beside her. "Mom's breaking the windows," Katie cried. "Where's your dad?" Scarlet asked. At home, Katie sniffled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Come with me. Your leg is cut." "Let's clean it up," Scarlet said gently, picking Katie up. Katie hugged her tightly, burying her face in Scarlet's neck. Scarlet took the girl inside and treated her wound. Trying to distract her, she took an old book from the shelf, one filled with fairy tales her parents used to read to her as a child. "Would you like to hear a story?" Scarlet asked softly. "Yes, I love fairy tales," Katie said, her eyes brightening. "Can I stay with you tonight?" "Of course, darling. You can stay with me," Scarlet reassured her. "Are you hungry?" "No," Katie replied, still shaken. "We'll have lunch now. You sit here and I'll go let your dad know that you're staying with me." Scarlet stepped out and went next door to inform Dan. He was standing on the veranda, tossing a suitcase to the ground. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone cold. "Katie's with me. She's scared." "Let her stay for a while," Scarlet explained. "Fine," Dan said, clearly worn out. Before Scarlet could leave, Dan spoke again. "I might not be back by evening. Can you keep Katie overnight? I'll pick her up in the morning." "Of course, don't worry," Scarlet said. "Where are you going?" "I'm taking Britney to her parents." "I've had enough," Dan replied, gesturing to the suitcase. Scarlet nodded silently and walked back home. She had no right to interfere in their relationship, nor did she want to. Dan's decisions were his own, and she didn't justify them. But in this situation, she only felt sorry for Katie, the innocent child caught in the middle of all this turmoil. As Scarlet walked away, Britney's screams could be heard from inside the house. "Dan, open the door. I'll break it down if you don't come out. You have no business here. Get in the car, you're leaving," Dan commanded, his voice stern. "Where to?" Britney asked, bewildered. "Home. It's not up for discussion." "I advise you not to anger me," Dan said, his frustration barely contained. Though drunk, Britney understood she needed to stay quiet. She obediently got into the car as Dan drove in silence, trying to keep his emotions in check. For 6 years he had tolerated a woman he never truly loved. He cursed the day he gave in to his mother's persuasion. Britney's father, James, was an influential figure in a neighboring village, and Betty had immediately seen the opportunities that would open up for her son. James had indeed helped Dan secure a position as an agronomist and built a large house for them. Materially, they had everything for a happy life, but happiness had never taken root in their home. There was no joy, no love. "Maybe you'll forgive me?" Britney whined from the back seat. "I don't want to go to my father's. And I don't want to see you drunk every day." "I'm sorry, but I've run out of patience. Is there some deep sorrow you're hiding? Why do you drink?" Dan responded. "You're going to your parents. Maybe they'll teach you how to behave." "It's all because of her, because of Scarlet." Britney tried to justify herself. "Don't lie. Scarlet just arrived a few days ago, but you've been drinking for years. What has Scarlet done to you? There's nothing between us, and there never will be." "Everything is in the past," Dan said firmly. "Do you think I don't see how you love her?" Britney snapped. You don't even hide it. You haven't seen much besides your bottle of alcohol for a long time, Dan retorted. When they arrived at James's house, Dan got out and headed toward the door. Britney's mother, Emma, saw them and immediately sensed something was wrong. Is something the matter? She asked. No, nothing serious, Dan reassured her, though his frustration was evident. Just look at your daughter. Britney stumbled out of the car, swaying unsteadily. What's going on, daughter? James asked, surprised. I feel terrible, Britney muttered, lowering her head. Don't try to make us feel sorry for you. Dan did the right thing bringing you here, James said firmly. I'll take her for treatment tomorrow, and if she doesn't cooperate, we'll have to take more drastic measures. I need to get back. Katie is waiting for me, Dan said. Maybe you should bring her here? Emma suggested. No, I can handle it myself, Dan responded before driving back home, his mood heavy. He would have divorced Britney on the spot if it weren't for Katie. He couldn't bear the thought of causing more pain to his daughter, who already suffered from their constant arguments. When Dan parked in front of the house, it was already dark. He hoped Scarlet and Katie were still awake. Seeing the light in Scarlet's house, he knocked softly on the window. Shh, Scarlet said as she stepped out. Katie's already asleep. Can she stay until morning? Dan asked. Okay, Scarlet nodded. Are you hungry? I have some food if you'd like. Dan hesitated. Sorry for being rude, but I'm too tired to cook tonight. He lied, he wasn't hungry, he just didn't want to return to his empty home. Sit down, I'll warm up dinner, Scarlet offered, flustered. Dan sat at the small, neat table in the garden and sighed with relief. Finally, the long, exhausting day was over. Would you like some tea? Scarlet asked, placing a plate of hot potatoes and meat on the table. If you have something stronger, I won't refuse, Dan replied. Scarlet rummaged through her things and returned with a bottle. This is from my father's old supplies, she said, placing it on the table. Will you have dinner with me? Dan asked, grateful for the peaceful atmosphere. I haven't felt this calm in so long. Life just keeps rushing by, and I'm always running toward what? I don't even know. That's how life is, Scarlet replied as she sat down. My grandmother used to say life passes in the blink of an eye. They sat together, talking long into the night. It wasn't until dawn broke that they realized how much time had passed. It's time to rest, Scarlet finally said. Scarlet, I wanted to tell you something, Dan began, struggling to find the right words. No need. Scarlet interrupted. Everything has already been said. Don't go, Dan said softly, wrapping his arms around her. Scarlet wanted to run back into the house, lock herself in, and never come out again, but she couldn't. I still love you, she whispered, responding to his kiss. I'm happy to hear that, Dan smiled. But I can't break up your family, Scarlet said, her voice trembling. We shouldn't have done this. It's all wrong. Don't start this, Dan interrupted. I'll divorce Britney, and we'll get married. No, Scarlet replied firmly. I don't want to take you away from your family. It feels like fate doesn't want us to be together. I regret coming back. Honestly, I thought I didn't love you anymore. Scarlet, what's gotten into you? Dan asked, confused. Everything was fine a moment ago. Katie will wake up soon. You'll take her and leave, and I'll sell my house. We can't be together. I don't want your wife and mother to hate me forever, Scarlet said, her voice breaking. As you wish, Dan said, unable to hide his disappointment. I won't try to persuade you. He went inside to retrieve the sleepy Katie. Deeply hurt, he felt like Scarlet had toyed with his emotions and then discarded him. I've lived without you before, and I'll keep living without you, Dan muttered as he carried Katie to the car. Sell your house and go wherever you want. Where's Mom? Katie asked cautiously as they drove. She's a little sick, sweetheart. But she'll get better and come back soon, Dan reassured her. But in his heart, he felt only emptiness. Even if Britney stopped drinking, he couldn't be happy with her. After reconnecting with Scarlet, he couldn't bear the thought of being with anyone else. 3 months passed. Dan enrolled Katie in daycare and learned to manage the household himself while Britney was in the clinic. Britney's parents visited occasionally, but they saw that Dan and Katie were doing well and left without worry. During that time, Dan avoided any contact with Scarlet. He deliberately kept his distance, not wanting to run into her. One evening, James, Britney's father, arrived unexpectedly. His expression was both puzzled and distraught. What is it? Dan asked, immediately sensing something was wrong. Britney has disappeared, James replied gravely. What do you mean she's disappeared? Dan asked, alarmed. When did this happen? Have you told the police? Sit down, Dan. We need to talk, James said with a heavy sigh. I'm sorry we didn't tell you earlier. We thought things would improve. Britney disappeared on the third day of her stay at the clinic. She didn't exactly disappear, she ran away. Ran away? To where? Dan was stunned. She found someone like herself, another patient undergoing treatment for alcoholism. They ran off together, James explained. Did you find her? Dan asked, still in shock. I did, just yesterday. She told me she had no parents, no husband, no child. She doesn't want anything to do with us anymore, James said, tears filling his eyes. I came here for Katie, James continued. My wife and I are still healthy enough to raise her. We think it's best if she comes with us. Hearing that her grandfather wanted to take her, Katie rushed to her father's side. Daddy, I want to stay here, at home, she whispered, fear evident in her voice. Go to your room and watch cartoons, sweetheart. Grandpa and I need to talk, Dan said calmly. Katie quickly ran off, firmly closing the door behind her, making it clear that her home was with her father. Dan turned to James. Katie stays with me. My daughter will stay with me. I'm sorry, but that's not up for discussion, Dan said firmly. James sighed. I expected that answer, but understand I had to offer to take Katie. We'll always be nearby. I hope you're not upset with us. Of course not. Why would I be? Katie and I will visit, and you're welcome to come over anytime, Dan smiled, genuinely appreciating James's offer, though inwardly relieved that Britney wouldn't be coming back. Thank you, James said, shaking Dan's hand before hurrying home. The next day, Katie returned from the store looking upset. She placed the bread on the table and went silently to her room. Katie, what's wrong? Did someone upset you? Dan asked, sensing her mood. She left, Katie said sadly. Who? Scarlet, Dan asked, alarmed. I just saw her. She kissed me and told me to be a good, obedient girl and always listen to you, Katie explained. Dan's heart sank. What a fool I am, he muttered. Did she go to the bus stop? Yes, with big suitcases, Katie replied. Let's go, we have to catch up, Dan said, picking Katie up as he rushed out the door. Fear surged through him if he didn't make it in time. He might lose her forever. The bus station was crowded, but Dan spotted Scarlet standing off to the side, staring into the distance. Scarlet. Katie called out. My dad and I barely caught up with you. Scarlet turned, surprised to see them. She hadn't expected this encounter and was unsure of what to say. Are you leaving? Dan asked, already knowing the answer. Yes, I sold the house. I'm planning to buy one closer to the city, Scarlet replied quietly. Will you take us with you? Dan asked boldly. Scarlet blinked in surprise, not understanding. Take you with me? Please take us with you, Scarlet, Katie pleaded sincerely. The bus appeared in the distance and the crowd began to stir. But you don't have any belongings, Scarlet said, smiling sadly. We'll pack them quickly. Will you wait for us? Dan asked. But how? I sold the house, and this is the last bus, Scarlet said, clearly conflicted. We can accommodate you at our place, Dan winked at Katie. Of course. We have plenty of space, Katie chimed in, trying to convince Scarlet. You've convinced me, Scarlet finally laughed. Dan wasted no time, grabbing her suitcases and heading toward the house as if afraid she might change her mind. Don't run so fast, we can't keep up. Scarlet laughed. I can't help it. I forgot to turn off the oven, and the chicken might burn, Dan admitted. Is that so? Well, we can't miss out on a delicious dinner. Scarlet teased, holding Katie's hand as they hurried back home. When they reached the kitchen, they realized they were too late. The chicken had indeed burned. It's okay, Dan smiled. I'll make a new one. We have our whole lives ahead of us. There's no need to be upset over a little chicken. Dan hugged Scarlet and Katie, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. This was his happiness, right here with them. Everything else was just minor details in life. It's hard to believe we're together now, Scarlet said, resting her head on Dan's shoulder. That we don't have to hide from anyone or fear judgment anymore. We should have done this a year ago, the moment we realized we couldn't live without each other, Dan replied softly. Why did you run away then? Maybe things would have turned out differently. You can't imagine what your mother did, Scarlet admitted. I've never seen anyone so malicious. I knew I was wrong to interfere in your family, but she scared me. I felt like she wanted to hurt me. My mother only cares about material things. She doesn't care about what's in my heart or what I want. She'll never understand that it's better to live simply and be happy than to spend your life with someone you don't love, Dan explained. What will she say about us? Scarlet asked, nervously. I don't care. I won't let anyone hurt you, not even my own mother, Dan reassured her. What should we do next? Maybe we should leave everything behind and start fresh. I have enough money for a house. It might not be as big as yours, but it'll be ours, and we'll be free from all this, Scarlet suggested. Dan thought for a moment. That's a good idea, but why should we leave? I have a good job here, a large estate. Why run away? I'll divorce Britney soon, and if she comes back, I'll send her packing. Scarlet pondered his words. He was right, leaving a stable job and a familiar home for the unknown didn't seem wise, especially with a child in tow. Besides, the village held too many memories for her. Despite everything, she loved it here. Dan, you always dreamed of starting a bee farm. Maybe we should give it a try? I have enough money for that, Scarlet suggested with a smile. So we're staying? Dan's face lit up like a child's. He lifted Scarlet off her feet and spun her around playfully. Put me down. I'm heavy. Scarlet laughed. I don't care. Dan grinned. So the bee farm, are you in? Of course, Scarlet replied, her smile growing. They spent the entire day making grand plans, with Katie excitedly imagining all the bees producing sweet honey. She had grown very attached to Scarlet, always sticking by her side. But the joyful atmosphere was abruptly interrupted by the arrival of Betty. The rumors of Scarlet selling her house and moving in with Dan had reached her, and she was furious. Storming into the yard, she waved her hands angrily. What's going on here? Startled, Katie ran to her father, clinging to him as she trembled in fear. Take Katie inside, Dan whispered to Scarlet, his voice tense. I'll talk to my mother. Betty, fuming, was taken aback when Dan blocked her path. How dare you speak to me like that? I'm your mother. Not today, you're not, Dan said coldly. Turn around and leave, or I'll make you leave. I won't let anyone, not even you, ruin this for me. Scarlet stays with me, and if you can't accept that, don't come back. Betty was shocked by her son's defiance. Are you really willing to throw me out over this woman? She spat angrily. And where's Britney? That's none of your concern, Dan said. I won't discuss this with you. Realizing that she wasn't going to get through to him, Betty stormed off, leaving the yard without another word. She hated Scarlet with a burning passion, just as she had hated Scarlet's mother years ago for stealing her fiancé. That resentment had never left her, and now it had transferred to Scarlet. She left, Scarlet said softly, returning to Dan. Don't take it to heart, Dan reassured her. It's just noise. We don't need to listen to what others say or want. We make our own life now. We should still leave, Scarlet asked timidly. No, we will live in our own house. We don't need to go anywhere, Dan reassured her. Dan hugged Scarlet and Katie, wiping away his daughter's tears. He vowed that they would never cry over other people's offenses again. 6 months later, Dan launched a major operation as a professional beekeeper. He filed for divorce. And since Britney didn't show up for the court hearing, they divorced without her consent. Dan and Scarlet began preparing for their wedding, inviting only close friends and neighbors. Scarlet had no relatives to invite, and they decided not to invite Dan's mother, as she had cut off communication with both her son and granddaughter. Betty, filled with immense resentment toward Scarlet, refused to be a part of their lives. During the wedding celebration, with everyone singing and dancing joyfully, Britney quietly slipped into the yard unnoticed. She smirked, sitting down at the table, drinking shot after shot of alcohol. Dad, my mom's here. Katie ran up to Dan, trembling with fear. Unpleasant memories of her scandalous mother, who had shown no interest in her, flooded her mind. Don't be afraid, sweetheart. What are you scared of? Dan smiled, handing Katie over to Scarlet. He then approached Britney, grabbing her hand and pulling her away from the table. Who allowed you to come here? Dan asked angrily. How dare you, after everything you've done? What right do you have to kick me out? Britney smirked. Or have you forgotten who built this house for us? Ask anyone in the village, they all know this house was built with my father's money. Now think about who should leave here. Britney, please don't ruin our celebration. You left me, and there's nothing to discuss. Come tomorrow, and we can talk calmly. Now isn't the time, Dan pleaded, trying to prevent an impending scandal. Fine, Britney reluctantly agreed. But you better pack your things. I won't allow her to live in my house. With that, Britney left, but not before spoiling the mood. The guests, sensing the tension, began to disperse awkwardly. Dan, is it true? Does this house belong to Britney? Scarlet asked, shocked. Why didn't you think about this possibility earlier? What are we going to do now? Dan didn't sleep that night, haunted by Britney's visit. He feared what might happen if she followed through on her threats. To some extent, she was right, the house was built with her father's help. But Dan had also invested money and time into it, deciding to act quickly. He made up his mind to talk to his former father-in-law. Where are you going? Scarlet asked, waking up to see Dan getting dressed. I'm going to talk to her father. Don't worry, we built this house together. We won't end up on the streets, Dan reassured her. Scarlet remained quiet, feeling a mix of fear and regret. She knew they were in a precarious situation but could only hope Dan would sort it out. When Dan arrived at James's house, he greeted his former father-in-law. Hello, James. I heard you got married. Congratulations, James said. Yes, I'm sorry I didn't invite you, but Britney came yesterday and spoiled everything, Dan replied. She hasn't been home. I don't know where she's gone, James said, surprised. She came to kick us out of the house, Dan explained. James shook his head, chuckling nervously. I've been thinking about your divorce. You have no claims against you or your wife. My daughter is an alcoholic, and I've accepted that. I've kicked her out of my house, and after I'm gone, the house will go to Katie. As for the house you live in, it's yours. Thank you, Dan said sincerely. You've done a lot there, you've become a master beekeeper, and Britney would only ruin everything. I trust you more than my own daughter, James added. I appreciate that. By the way, I wanted to ask you about Katie, James said cautiously. You're starting a new life, a new family. Maybe it would be better if Katie lived with us? Dan responded firmly, I love Katie as my own, and she's grown close to Scarlet. She even calls her mom. I see no reason to take her away from us. Thank you, Dan, James said, touched by his response. Do you have any idea where Britney might be? Dan asked. A couple of weeks ago, your mother came to me. She asked for Britney's address. Now I'm starting to understand why, James revealed. Let's go. We need to find out what's going on, Dan said, determined. Together, they quietly entered Betty's yard. Dan heard his mother's voice coming from inside the house. Tell him that either he comes back to you, or he'll be homeless, Betty was saying. And I'll disinherit him if he doesn't reconcile with you. Remember, you can also threaten to take Katie away. Dan loves his daughter too much to let that happen. Dan and James exchanged glances, furious. James entered first. What are you doing here, Betty? He asked sharply. Dan followed. How could you, Mom? He demanded. Dan, I'm doing this for your own good, Betty replied, tears streaming down her face. I don't want to see or hear you anymore, Dan said, his voice cold. Turning to Britney. He added, forget the way to our house. Without waiting for a response, Dan stormed out, deeply hurt by his mother's betrayal. Dan, wait. James called out, I'll give you a ride, and I'd like to see Katie. As they returned to the house, Dan felt grateful for James's support. Don't let this get to you, James advised. Life is full of unpleasant surprises, but we'll get through this. Inside, Scarlet and Katie were drawing at the table. Katie proudly showed Scarlet her picture. Mama, look. Do you like it? Scarlet smiled and kissed her forehead. It's beautiful. Who's this? That's Daddy, that's you, and this is me, Katie said, beaming. And what's this you're holding? A little sister? Scarlet asked playfully. Will I have a sister? Katie asked eagerly. I hope so, Scarlet smiled. But she looks more like a kitten. They both laughed. At that moment, Dan and James entered the room. Hello, James, Scarlet greeted him, standing up quickly. You don't need to worry about me, Scarlet. I'm here to support Dan and Katie. You're a wonderful addition to this family, James said warmly. Thank you, Scarlet said, smiling with relief. Let's sit down for lunch. Katie and I prepared something special, Scarlet offered, finally feeling like their future was safe.